With extra money in people's pockets, discretionary income, if you will, you saw the consumer culture emerge in the 1920s, and it changed society. You had the emergence of electric refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and yeah, cars. Okay. So many cars were purchased in the 1930s that roughly 30 million cars were out on the roads at the end of the decade. Nowadays, we think, gosh, there are so many cars all over the country. Who doesn't have a car, right? I don't care if you got a beater, some, really old car that barely goes, you got a car, right? Well, back in the 1920s, that was still somewhat unusual, but it was a demonstration of what would emerge. It was often popular for people to have wristwatches and smoke cigarettes. Women began buying cosmetics more readily. And so you have this age of consumerism that was also largely driven by advertising advancements. Many advertising campaigns were launched during the World War I era so as to garner support for the war effort and war bonds to help us pay for it. That eventually spilled over into commercial society to where now you have advertisements that are targeted towards people who perhaps could consume certain things. Women, if you're interested in putting on makeup and looking differently, well, here's the cosmetic advertisement. Or look at this car you can drive. You can have the lifestyle you want with this XYZ vehicle over here. Don't you want that? Don't you want to have your lifestyle? Various other different things. You have the idea of the super salesman kind of thing come about too. Come over here at our furniture store. You can buy this, this, and this. Nowadays, you go to IKEA and you can like build something out of a whittled piece of wheat, and there you go. But otherwise, so it was the idea of promotion, salesmanship. If you've ever wondered why car dealerships sometimes have some of the sales tactics they do, the idea really began in the 1920s and it took off after World War II. We'll talk about that later on. But the emerging consumerism was responsible for so many of the different advancements in the ways that Americans consumed um, items with their discretionary income. It would also lead to commercial radio being further advented. Okay, mass circulation of magazines. You think Sports Illustrated, Time Magazine, People Magazine. You go to the supermarket, you see like the National Enquirer and all these others. I haven't actually thumbed through a magazine probably in several years. Everything I do is pretty much on my phone, but otherwise, that's just kind of how it was. But magazines were really big around this time. Other things that were also emerging as a result of our consumer changes was the idea that with more women being educated in our colleges, therefore becoming eligible to work in professional type settings, you have a new professional woman begin to emerge. Okay? And I mentioned the reality that some of these women were faced with um, because oftentimes women were deemed in old Victorian standards as having to be prim, having to be proper, you're going to take care of your children. But if you're a working woman professional, you have other different things. Oftentimes, marriages would be arranged, or maybe you married a man out of necessity, or maybe out of societal guilt, if you will. The idea for new professional women around this time also advented the idea of compassionate marriages. Is it too much to ask to actually love the person that you marry and be attracted to them and also want to have a family with them? Is that too much to ask for? That should be the ideal goal. You should have respect, admiration, and companionship values with the person you want to spend the rest of your life with, right? Okay? Is it too much to ask for me to love this person romantically? The old Victorian era that sex was only for procreation, even for married couples, begins to be questioned around this time. If this is my husband and I'm in love with him, or this is my wife and I'm in love with her, why can't we have sex? We're a married couple. We are, in the eyes of God, doing things right. Why is it only for procreation? Why can't we just enjoy ourselves, especially if we're married? And then it extends beyond marriage. But otherwise, though, other aspects are being redefined. Companionate marriages are more than just done out of necessity or arrangement. They're now out of, well, I love this person. I want to spend the rest of my life with this person. Okay. So that also begins to be redefined. Women also around this time begin to concern themselves a little bit more so with how gender roles are defined. Women are still largely at home around this era, but it also begins to question the idea of, okay, just how much so? Oh, and by the way, what if I get pregnant? What if I already have a bunch of kids? Oh God, I'm pregnant again. Okay. We mentioned Margaret Sanger in the last chapter when we discussed eugenics. Okay. We discussed some of the more sinister things that she was involved with. One of the things that was better was she was a strong advocate for birth control and making birth control more readily available so as to prevent women from becoming chronically pregnant. If Benjamin Franklin was like the 15th out of 17 children. Can you imagine a woman having 17 children and being pregnant every year? Oh, and she still has all these little ones to do. Oh my God, that just seems like an extreme nightmare. Okay? That was reality for a lot of people, especially if you were poor, especially if you were an immigrant. Margaret Sanger at least had the idea, let's take this new technological advance called birth control, let's make it readily available, and let's keep women from being chronically pregnant. And let's do something about this. Okay? She had some other ideas in mind with it, but the idea of being an activist to help women from chronic pregnancy became around this time. Okay? Also, other things began to question. You have various different women reformers who question old Victorian feminine standards. What if a woman wants to smoke? What if a woman wants to have a drink? What if she wants to go dancing? What if she wants to wear something more seductive as opposed to something prim and proper? What if a woman wants to just kind of liberate herself and just live her life? What if she wants to wear makeup and go to parties, for crying out loud? America at this time began to explore the idea of modern women who have a little bit more of a liberated mindset, who wanted to do things that were non-conventional and out of the ordinary from a Victorian standpoint. They wanted to express themselves the way that they dressed, the way that they acted, the way that they put their hair up, the way that they spoke, and the way that they behaved. Why can't they have a drink? That's a good question. You have a number of urban, lower to lower middle class women emerge around this time who question all those things. Okay? Oftentimes they were working class single women, typically from, your lower middle class to middle class urban type environments, who question the idea of conventionalism. Why can't I go out and have a drink and go dancing and have a cigarette? Okay. Enter in the emergence of the flapper girl. Okay? Oh, the flapper girls are going out to a speakeasy to go have a drink and a smoke. Okay. Every old-timey 1920s video I've ever heard, you have some guy who sounds like that. Okay? The flapper girls is like... Okay. I digress. Otherwise, though, you have women around this era who flock to that flapper lifestyle. Okay? And it's a rejection of the societal Victorian norm that women have to be prim and proper and walk so much so that they should be able to balance a book on their head, and they must dress a certain way and cover every inch, expose no skin. Okay. That begins to be questioned. Women should act a certain way. Do they, though? Okay. That begins to be questioned, and it creates a larger aspect of female activism that grew attention to both political parties, Democrat and Republican, that would lead to more of an involvement in political culture in the 1920s for women, especially now that women now have suffrage. They're able to vote. They can make their voices heard. Why not do something about it? But speaking of voices being heard, it was around this era that people began to see the rising importance of consumerism, entertainment, and they really began to question a lot of the consumer mindset that would engulf people. It's almost like an addiction. People would become addicted to consumerism. And you have various different works from novelists like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein, who noticed that people grew up in the World War I era, and in the 1920s they gave way to consumerism that defined their lifestyles, and they were consumed with consumerism, if that makes sense. So people would write about that. They would critique this new emerging modern society. Um, what can we do to really kind of curb this obsession with consumerism? So, The Great Gatsby was F. Scott Fitzgerald's great work in the 1920s, and there's actually two movies made about it. The first one was with Robert Redford that came out in the 1970s. That's the one I hope you would maybe watch on Netflix someday. The Great Gatsby with Robert Redford. And in it, you have this incredibly wealthy man, Gatsby, who throws all these lavish parties that he doesn't actually attend. And he's got other things, but it's basically meant to be a metaphor for the emerging obsession with consumer society. Okay, so think about that. Then there was one with Leo DiCaprio that came out about 5, 10 years ago, somewhere or so, and it was really weird because it had like modern hip hop music set to the 1920s era, and it's an interesting take. I don't know if I quite agree with it, but it's like, okay, they probably wouldn't have that in 1924, but okay, they did in 2014. All right. But otherwise, though, you have folks who begin to see, well, first of all, they began to question also why we went to war in World War One in the first place. Uh, it's not like we were attacked, and it's not like there was a great cause for the war. There'd be a different cause for a big war in a couple decades. But otherwise, World War One, people began to question that. So the idea of questioning why things have to happen a certain way really emerges around this time as well.